Barabbas or Jesus? When the guards brought Jesus back to Pilate, he went outside to the balcony of the praetorium where his judgment seat had been set up. After calling for silence, he said to them, "You have brought this man before me, accusing him of corrupting the people, forbidding the payment of taxes, and claiming to be the king of the Jews. I have questioned him and cannot find him guilty of these charges. In fact, I find no fault in this man." I then sent him to Herod, and the tetrarch must have reached the same conclusion, for he has sent him back to us. Truly, this man has done nothing deserving of death. If you still believe he should be punished, I am willing to have him severely scourged before I release him, so that he will refrain from involving himself in your religious matters in the future. When Pilate saw from the crowd's reaction that all reason was lost and heard how they loudly cursed him, he decided to attempt to sway the crowd's sentiment. He motioned for silence, and when everyone had finally calmed down, he made a rational offer to the people. It was customary during the Passover festival for the people to choose a prisoner or condemned man to be pardoned. Pilate now tried to use this to his advantage and extricate himself from this difficult situation. He gave the people the choice by suggesting that, since Jesus was now in custody and standing before his judgment seat, he would release this man from Galilee as a gesture of goodwill during the Passover festival. A few weeks earlier, the Romans had arrested a certain Barabbas. Barabbas was a notorious bandit, the son of a priest. He had confessed and was convicted of robbery and murder. He had been active for a long time on the road between Jericho and Jerusalem, and the inhabitants of those cities were relieved that he had finally been caught. Pilate had recently confirmed his death sentence, and the execution was to take place as soon as the Passover festivities were over. Pilate stood up and explained to the people that Jesus had been brought before him by the chief priests who wanted him put to death on certain charges, and that he himself believed this man did not deserve to die. Pilate said, "Therefore I ask you, who do you prefer that I release, Barabbas the murderer, or this Jesus from Galilee?" Pilate had barely finished speaking when the accusers from the Sanhedrin shouted as loudly as they could, "Barabbas, Barabbas." And when the people saw that the chief priests intended to have Jesus put to death, this misery spread through the crowd, and soon the entire crowd was shouting loudly for Barabbas to be released. Just 5 days earlier, this same crowd had led him into Jerusalem with cheers, and had listened in awe as he taught them at the temple. However, the people did not admire a king in chains who called himself the Son of God, but who now stood helpless before them as a prisoner. Jesus could have been a hero in the eyes of the common people when he drove the money changers and merchants out of the temple, but not when he was a passive prisoner in the hands of his enemies, standing trial in a matter that involved his life. Pilate became angry when he saw how the chief priests clamored for the pardon of a notorious murderer and demanded the blood of Jesus. In his heart, he felt a deep contempt for these backward people. He saw their malice and hatred and perceived their prejudice and envy. So he said in an indignant voice, "How can you choose the life of a murderer over the life of this man, whose worst offense is that he figuratively calls himself the King of the Jews?" But this last remark was like pouring oil on the fire. The Jews were a proud people who were now subjected to the political yoke of the Romans, but who hoped for the coming of the Messiah, who would deliver them from pagan slavery with great power and glory. They deeply resented Pilate, more than he could realize, for implying that this gentle teacher of strange doctrines could be on par with their expected Messiah. The phrase, "the King of the Jews," was fuel to the fire. They saw this remark as an insult to everything they held sacred and honorable, and so they all shouted even louder for the release of Barabbas and the death of Jesus. Pilate knew that Jesus was innocent, and if he had been a just and courageous judge, he would have acquitted and released him. However, he was afraid to confront these angry Jews, and while he hesitated to do his duty, a messenger came running up with a sealed message from his wife, Claudia. Pilate signaled to the crowd, which had gathered before him, that he wished to read the message he had just received before continuing with the case at hand. When Pilate opened the letter from his wife, he read, "I would urgently advise you not to involve yourself in the case of this innocent, righteous man who is called Jesus. I have suffered greatly in a dream last night because of him." This message from his wife greatly disturbed Pilate, causing him to withdraw briefly to his private quarters. This delay in the proceedings gave the Jewish leaders ample time to move freely among the people and incite them to call for the release of Barabbas and to demand with all force the crucifixion of Jesus. When Pilate returned, he looked shaken and asked the people, "What shall I do with him who is called the King of the Jews?" And they all cried out in unison, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" The unanimity of this demand from the incited crowd shocked and alarmed Pilate, and he became gripped by fear. Pilate then said again, "Why do you want to crucify this man? What evil has he done? Who will come forward and testify against him?" But when they heard Pilate speak these words in defense of Jesus, they only shouted louder, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Then Pilate once again appealed to them regarding the release of a prisoner, saying, "Once more I ask you, which of these prisoners shall I release during your Passover feast?" And again the crowd, incited by the accusers, shouted, "Give us Barabbas!" Then Pilate said, "If I release the murderer Barabbas, what shall I do with Jesus?" And the crowd shouted again in unison, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" The continuous shouting of the crowd, spurred on by the council members of the Sanhedrin, was a horror to Pilate. Nevertheless, he decided to make one more attempt to satisfy the crowd and save Jesus.